Hello everybody, thank you for joining me. I am the Why Guy, and this is episode 2, the Federal Reserve and Why It Matters. But before we get into the Federal Reserve, let's take a moment to thank our sponsor, shall we? The Why Guy is brought to you today by my damn self. So buy a t-shirt. Many of you have probably heard of the Federal Reserve. Some of you may even know it's the central bank of the United States. Most countries have central banks, but what does that actually mean? What role does it play in our society? Why was it founded in the first place? What kinds of powers does it have? Most importantly, why should you care? These are the kinds of issues we're going to be talking about today in relation to the Federal Reserve, and I believe I can show you in less than 15 minutes why this should be the number one economic issue that everybody is talking about, because it's the number one reason why 78% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck in the richest, most productive economy in history. Ever. You don't get a lot of information about the Federal Reserve from politicians or pundits on either side of the aisle, from the corporate news media. You don't even really learn about this in school. And I would argue that that lack of transparency is a really good thing for the Federal Reserve, because if the average citizen understood the history and track record or the purpose of this institution, we would be protesting it in the streets. The Federal Reserve is a private bank that in 1913 was founded with government oversight and given a monopoly over the ability to create US dollars that we all have to pay taxes in and accept. It was also asked to fund the government. I'm sure it's no coincidence that the entity created to fund the government has an unlimited ability to create money, but we'll come back to that. It's also the only bank in the United States that never has to go through an audit, so its financial records are never made public. So to recap, it is a private bank with government oversight that has the unlimited ability to create money and is also the least transparent bank in the country. Before we go any farther, we have to stop for a second and think about what that means. We have one monopoly institution that has an unlimited power to create and destroy US dollars. What that means is that 1/2 of every transaction in the country is controlled by one monopoly. You cannot reasonably say that you have a free market when half of every trade in the entire country is controlled by a government-granted monopoly. This is the reason that Vladimir Lenin said that the establishment of a central bank is the most important step to socializing a nation. The moment you have an institution like this, you cannot claim to be a fully capitalist economy. This is a socialist institution, and it's been controlling fully half of our economy since 1913. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of how the Fed really operates, humor me for a second. Let's talk about the history of this institution. Why is it that we have it in the first place? Why is it that in 1913 everybody decided, after 120 years of this, dollar getting stronger, what we really need is a little bit of that. Now the answer to that starts with the Panic of 1907. Now I am not going to do a deep dive into the Panic of 1907 because I want people to keep watching this video.
But the short version is that a couple of people borrowed a lot of money in order to corner the copper market. They failed. So the banks and trusts that they had borrowed a lot of money from in order to try to do this lost all of those loans they gave out. So they started going under. Well, JP Morgan, all of his wealth was tied up in these banks, trusts, investment companies. So he basically organized a private bailout. It's not unlike the 2008-2009 bailouts, except it was private. It was a bunch of rich people trying to save their own wealth. So JP Morgan and his buddies looked around and said, wow, that was a close one. How do we make sure that the next time something like this happens, we don't have to risk our own money to bail ourselves out?
This is how the Federal Reserve got started. So JP Morgan set up a secret and now infamous meeting in Jekyll Island, Georgia between 7 men to rewrite the rules of the financial system. We're really only concerned with 2 of these men right now. One of them is Senator Nelson Aldrich. The other would be Paul Warburg. Aldrich was a very influential senator at the time from the state of Rhode Island. He was also very clearly the monopoly guy. Now Warburg split his time between being the director of Wells Fargo and Company and harassing Princess Peach with his brothers. Now, Warburg was a highly regarded expert on financial systems. He was a public policy expert and public advocate for central banking, and of course he would advocate central banking. He was born in Germany to a family that was an absolute banking dynasty. How well connected was this guy exactly? His older brother Max is most well known for being the German banker who funded Vladimir Lenin in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and all of the beautiful things that came from that. Side note, Paul Warburg's son, James Warburg, an advisor to FDR, addressed the U.S. Senate in 1950 and left us this little gem. Yeah, I'll give you a moment, really just take that one in. So these 7 rich, powerful men got together in secret and just spent all week thinking, how can we help these poor people? I mean, we're so rich and they're so poor. We got to do something about this. So, oh wait, what do you call that? There's a word for that, when 7 people meet together in secret to make rules for hundreds of millions. Oh, that's right, you call it a conspiracy. When asked 20 years later why this meeting had been so secretive, Frank Vanderlip said, there wasn't a lot of trust in Wall Street. The people would not have wanted the rules for the financial system to be written by private Wall Street bankers. I think he might have been right. So the result of this secret week-long Help the Poor Summit was called Aldrich's Plan. Nelson Aldrich took what they discussed at this meeting and proposed it to the Senate the next year. It was actually fiercely campaigned against by Woodrow Wilson, who was running for president at the time. Then he won, and then passed an identical bill. So politics really hasn't changed at all. Also part of the reason why Woodrow Wilson is the worst president in U.S. history, so much so that he is getting his own video. So enough of that conspiracy talk. Let's get into how the Federal Reserve actually works, shall we? It's nuts and bolts time. So the goals and powers of the Federal Reserve revolve around what's known as the dual mandate, which is actually 3 things. But it's the dual mandate. Now the first of the 2 mandates is to foster maximum employment. Now does anybody know what constitutes maximum employment? No, neither do they. There is no definition of this. There is no concrete goal here. It's kind of a nebulous term that affords the Federal Reserve a lot of leeway. But you might be sitting there asking yourself, how is it that a private bank, just through creation of money, can affect employment and employment numbers in an economy of 330 million people? And if you're asking yourself that, shut up. Okay, stop talking. You just don't know what you're talking about. The answer, we're told, relies on the Phillips curve. Now, the Phillips curve is an economic model that supposes that unemployment and inflation have an inverse relationship. Essentially, when unemployment is very low, lots of people have jobs, so they're spending money, and that sends prices up, causing inflation. And according to the Phillips curve, the opposite is true. When unemployment is high, not many people have money because they don't have jobs, and so inflation is low, or you even get the ultimate boogeyman, deflation. There are 2 problems with using this economic model to justify the Fed's actions. One is that inflation is not a law of growth. Just because there's low unemployment doesn't mean you get inflation. We've had several deflationary booms in this country where prices fell, but wages, real wages, standards of living, economic outcomes went up for every economic tier. In fact, we'll revisit this, but deflation is actually a pretty good thing for poor people. On the flip side, we've also had periods of stagflation, like the 1970s, where unemployment was very high, but inflation was also very high. In short, the predictions of this economic model have failed more times than Joe Biden's thought process.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
COVID has taken this year, just since the outbreak, has taken more than 100 years. Look, here's the lives. When you think about it.
The second problem with using this model is that the Phillips curve really supposes that unemployment drives inflation, but the Fed is trying to work backwards. They're trying to create inflation in the hopes that it lowers unemployment. That's a little bit like trying to cure an illness by manipulating the symptoms. They're trying to do this backwards. There is no direct way they have to affect unemployment. So they just create money, create inflation, give it out in the hopes that these companies, that these big banks and corporations just use it to hire people. But that's not always what they do with it. In fact, sure, they can hire people with this new money, but they can also spend that new money on capital equipment that actually reduces their need for employees. They can spend the money on stock buybacks, on speculation, on real estate. There is no end to the number of things these bankers and big corporations can do with this newly created money. So while it sounds nice to say the Fed can create maximum employment, in practice, all they can do is create inflation by giving money to bankers and big corporations, which is exactly what you would expect from an institution founded by bankers and big corporations.
Doesn't anyone notice this? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
The second part of the Fed's mandate is to stabilize prices and moderate long-term interest rates. Now, these two goals are effectively one, since the way they stabilize prices is by controlling the interest rate. So before we go any farther, we have to understand what the interest rate is. So the interest rate is the most important number in the economy. It is essentially the price of money over time. It plays a coordinating function in the economy between lenders and borrowers, savers and spenders. So a high interest rate tells people money is precious. We need more savings and less borrowing. It is a communication to the economy that says, hey, we've had too many expenditures, too much expansion, too many risks and new ventures, and we don't have enough savings to pay for it all over the long term. So save money, you get a very high return on your savings, but you also pay a very high interest rate for borrowing money. So it is a communication that tells people to stop spending and expanding and start saving a little bit. And over time, a very high interest rate can cause deflation. A low interest rate, on the other hand, sends the opposite signal. It tells people it's very cheap to borrow money. Go expand, go take risks. We got plenty of savings. Just go ahead and spend as much money as you can. It typically causes inflation. It discourages savings because you're not getting any interest on your savings. So who wants to save when they're getting a 0.5% interest rate? In theory, all of this is fine. In a free market, the interest rates would fluctuate. They would be different from bank to bank. The problem with this in practice is that what the Federal Reserve has historically done to stabilize prices is to keep the interest rate lower than the market would prefer for long periods of time. That, over a long period of time, is how you get this. 120 years of the central bank encouraging spending, borrowing, risks, credit, and discouraging savings and frugality. That's how you get an explosion in prices. That's how you get a depression in purchasing power. I would argue that stable prices means prices don't go up or down very much over a long period of time. If you want to save $1 today, it'll still buy something in 20 years when you want to spend it. Instead, the dollar's value has lost 98% since the founding of the Federal Reserve. That means prices have gone up more than 50 times. And that's by the Fed's own numbers. In fact, we've lost 80% of the dollar's value just since 1971, when the dollar was decoupled from gold and the Fed was really unleashed. That is not stable prices. It's making you a little poorer all the time. In the 120 years before the founding of the Federal Reserve in this country, the average inflation rate was 0.2 to 0.4% per year. And that actually includes the Civil War, which was extremely inflationary. If you take that out, prices actually went down. The dollar actually got stronger over time. But in the 110 years since the Federal Reserve was founded, the average inflation rate is 3.65%. That means your wage, your savings, your retirement income gets cut in half every 19 years. If you don't get a 3% raise every single year, you are getting poorer by the day. But inflation is not bad for everyone. It's actually a windfall for anybody who owns a lot of wealth in assets or anybody who's got a lot of debt. So while your wage might only go up 2 or 3% a year if you're lucky, housing prices are going up double-digit percent, stock prices are skyrocketing. This is great if you own stocks, but what about the bottom 50% of the country that doesn't own any stocks? All right, it's great if you own a house and you see your equity going up, but what if you're part of the working class or a young adult or somebody trying to get your first leg up into wealth, somebody trying to buy that first house? It gets harder for you every year. Also, anybody who has a tremendous amount of debt wins in inflation because the value of the debt, the actual value of the debt goes down because you get to borrow money today and pay it back tomorrow in devalued dollars. So it's a windfall for huge debtors. And who's the largest debtor on the face of the planet? The U.S. government. This is why the Federal Reserve exists. This is why it was created. Essentially, forced constant inflation is a transfer of wealth from the poor and the elderly to debtors, to the U.S. Treasury, to large banks and corporations, to anybody who owns a huge amount of assets. It is essentially a tax that never has to be voted on. It never has to be passed. No politician ever loses their post over it. This is why the Federal Reserve exists. It is the only reason that the U.S. government isn't bankrupt already, and it is the biggest driver of wealth inequality in this country. If you want to see it in a picture, this is the value of your wage, of your savings, of your retirement income without a central bank. And this is the value with a central bank. This is why the Federal Reserve exists. If there's one thing you take from this video, please remember this. Dollars are not wealth. Wealth comes from productivity and resources. A dollar is like a share in the overall productivity and resources of your nation. When we print new dollars, we're just diluting your shares. When we print new dollars, we're not creating new wealth. We're not making a bigger pie. We're taking the same pie and cutting it into smaller slices. Your slice gets smaller, and the newly created slices are handed out to banks, the government, big corporations, whoever's well enough connected to get that new money. Like George Carlin said, it's a big club, and you ain't in it. The government is stealing your pie.
No kidding, this is my pie.
And they're doing it through an accounting trick that they expect you not to understand. And the fact that most people don't understand it, the fact that you don't hear about this in school or on CNN or in the newspaper, is the only reason that this system is still allowed to exist. The system depends on your ignorance of how it works. By expanding the money supply, the Federal Reserve literally has the power to rob from the poor and give to the rich. Is this a power that you think 12 private bankers should have? Is this a power that you think anybody should have? Because absent the Federal Reserve, this is a power over you that would not exist. And all of us would have a little bit more control over our own financial lives. Next time somebody talks to you about wealth inequality, why don't you point them towards the source? And it's not capitalism. Once again, I am the Why Guy. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. Most importantly, I hope you learned something. If you did, please like and subscribe, share it with your friends, start the conversation. Go buy you a provocative t-shirt, piss some people off in public, because I promise you the conversation starts and ends with you. They will not be having it on television.